We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, we're joined by Siraj Hashmi, who you might know if you're on Twitter. In fact, you almost certainly know him if you're on Twitter. He's sort of like the king of blue check trolls. Is that a good way to say it, Siraj?
I guess so.
He runs the list, capital T, capital L, which I'll have him tell us about in just a moment in case you aren't familiar with it. He's right now the host of the Habibi Bros. Siraj, what is the Twitter account for the Habibi Bros and the YouTube account? Where can people find it?
Yeah, so it's at Habibi, HABIBI_Bros, BROS. And you could just type in Habibi Bros into YouTube to find us there.
There you go. It's that simple. Well, Siraj is a guy with a great sense of humor, but we're going to start off, I think, on a much more somber note. As somebody from the Midwest, I kind of try very hard to avoid nationalizing local issues that take place in big cities. But there was something that happened in Washington, D.C., where I live and where Suraj lives last Friday that I think absolutely warrants national attention and concern and conversation. And that would be the clear murder of an Uber Eats driver who was tasered by the 13 and 15-year-old suspects as he was driving his car down by the ballpark here in DC, down in Navy Yard. And he was killed when the car crashed. And as this is all documented on video, which made its way onto social media pretty much immediately, as one of the girls is being taken into custody, she complains that her phone is still in the driver's car while he is laying lifeless on the pavement not far away. Suraj, and this Uber Eats driver, I believe, was Pakistani. What was your reaction when you saw this video go viral last week?
I only saw it like over the weekend because I think that's when the video went viral. Obviously, it's a very tragic and awful and graphic video. I mean, there were many people who were saying to take it down, but I mean, it was disturbing and violent, but I don't think it met the, I think, standard for people to take it down. I think it was the necessary video for people to watch to understand sort of just kind of the times we're living in now. I mean, these are 13 and 15-year-old girls. I mean, they're charged with felony murder and trying to carjack an Uber Eats driver. And I think, there are obviously a lot of different, angles at play here. For one, obviously, a lot of people are trying to highlight the race of the victim, Muhammad Omar. He's a Pakistani American, immigrated here, Uber Eats driver trying to make an honest living. Obviously, horrible situation. Obviously, I pray for him and his family. Luckily, there's a GoFundMe that's out there right now. I've been sharing it on social media, as a lot of other people have as well, to obviously help his family. Because we're in tough times. If you're working Uber Eats, you're trying to extend and basically expand and find as many opportunities as you can. And if for someone like him to be a target of such a petty crime that turns into a horrific and almost, I wouldn't say heinous, but it just spun out of control. One thing that's obviously very fascinating to me, and I haven't highlighted this because I don't think it's relevant, and that is obviously the race of the actual perpetrators. They're two black girls, and there's some people who have been trying to highlight that, like that is somehow a factor here. I think it's actually more important and more relevant about the race of the actual driver being Pakistani. I think a lot of South Asians are sort of viewed as being easy targets in the United States, and that you can steal their car, they won't fight back. And I think that's kind of something that, while we're having this reckoning, this awareness about anti-Asian discrimination, and sort of where we draw the line, and following the Atlanta shooting, and then you have the Boulder shooting. Now you have this. Obviously, there's not like a common theme. I think there's probably more relevant that these two girls saw an opportunity to steal a car, and they didn't plan it out. They didn't think that maybe this that we'll see obviously how the facts play out and what happens from this particular investigation and trial. But I think there's less of a racial motivating factor, but I think it is at least a little bit relevant in terms of whether or not they're going to carry out a crime. It's something as small as a carjacking that then turns into felony murder.
There was something so disturbing about how mundane the video was. The video starts, the most viral video starts with the victim himself. The camera's pretty close up on him, and it ends with him lying lifeless on the pavement in pretty short order. And I have to imagine, somebody who is Pakistani and has a father he loved very much, that it had to have been really hard to watch, because it's one of those videos where it just seems so immediate, or one of those circumstances where it does just seem so immediate. There's something about it. It's like you can really see yourself or your family in it.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because I don't really think about that type of stuff from the beginning. I always just think like, all right, what are the facts of the situation? Just because obviously those are obviously the most important, just to get the story straight. And maybe that's just like the journalistic mind that I have. And then, obviously in having this conversation with you now, it sort of dawns on me a little bit about, man, what if that was my dad? Obviously, you start to think about the how it would personally affect you. And it honestly didn't personally affect me until really just thinking about it this second, because my dad's a small guy. I mean, he is, maybe he's kind of tall like me, but he's very slender. It's kind of funny because there are things that like anybody does now that he doesn't do. Like he doesn't know how to swim. Like I'm worried about him like going in the pool. Like I haven't even thought about him like trying to fight back against someone like who's trying to steal his car. Like I obviously think, he probably would do hopefully the wise thing and just, disengage and hopefully just let them have the car. I don't know what happened in this situation with Muhammad Omar, in terms of whether he was fighting back or whether they tased him. So I don't know if he even had a choice at that point by the time the video started. So it's obviously it's a very sad situation. And obviously I have great concern for him and his family. And I guess that kind of boils over into how this has been portrayed in certain social media circles and certain media circles, and how it's almost dismissive of, this man's life, in an effort to try to play down possible tensions that happen between different racial or minority groups. And that's kind of what happened over the weekend, is that this sort of like everything just came to blows.
I want to get into that, because that's one of the things that made me want to have you on to talk about it, because part of what you do on Twitter is really sort of poke at and rankle the elite journalists who take themselves with the utmost seriousness, but then also routinely fail to uphold the values that they themselves purport to believe deeply in. One final question on this video. You said something interesting about people stereotyping perhaps Pakistani immigrants, and I think this probably also, there's an intersectionality also with age in this video. What do you think that stereotype is, that people see Pakistani immigrants perhaps as being polite to the effect that they will just perhaps give you the car? Is there something to that? You mentioned it, and I wanted to sort of dig into it a little bit, because I've not heard that, but it does.
Yeah, no.
I can kind of see that dynamic, in the video.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's cultural. I mean, it's certainly it's interesting. The immigrant mentality here in the United States for a lot of Pakistani, and I would extend it to Indian and Bangladeshi immigrants, because, the South Asian mindset is that like you work hard, you come to this country, you work hard, and you make something out of yourself. And you always extend your hand back to help those who are trying to do the same that you did, previously. So like, for example, like, my dad was not the first one to immigrate here to the United States out of his family. It was his older brother, who was a pulmonologist in Connecticut. And so that's what led my dad to Connecticut, in Hartford, Connecticut, which is where I'm from. And my dad, is a heart surgeon. So, and he did the same for like his siblings, and then his cousins, his nieces, nephews, that kind of thing. But there's always been sort of like the mindset of like, if someone's in need, you like take the shirt off your back, you give whatever you can. Money doesn't matter, because sometimes, and there's also an interesting way of looking at it, in terms of like, say for example, something as mundane and as benign as someone like speeding or driving recklessly. It's not the understanding of saying that person's an a-hole. What are they doing? They're driving horribly, to like, maybe that person has an emergency they have to be at. Like, that is the kind of like altering of your mindset that I think many people who come to this country think, particularly from South Asia. And so I don't know if it is sort of giving people more the benefit of the doubt, because that's just how I am always. But it is, in a way, maybe something's happening in their life you just don't understand, and maybe getting out of their way or letting them do what they think they need to do is just better for them. And maybe that is just something that's been extended to, Pakistanis and Indians and Bangladeshis are very polite and will just let you do what they want to do, and sometimes don't always put up a fight. And it's, everybody has, to different degrees of which they do that. But by and large, I mean, we're not a people who typically put up a lot of resistance.
So you've actually lived in Pakistan. Do videos like this affect pro or anti-American sentiment, do you think? Or is this sort of, maybe not something that would even break through in Pakistani media?
I don't think this would break through at all. I have honestly very little insight as to how it would be playing abroad anyways, because I mean, it's barely making the national media landscape. I mean, I can't imagine if it broke to international news, then, I doubt this would be like an international incident. But it is something that I think when people see it, they would be like, that person could be like my uncle. That person could be my dad. Like, I think there are a lot of, Pakistani second and third generation Pakistani Americans who would look at it and think, wow, that's very tough to watch. But I think if Muhammad Anwar was targeted simply because he was Pakistani American or simply because he was Pakistani, then there'd be, I think, more to it. But I think in this case where it was, I think we have to sort of dig deeper here and understand that there are levels of stereotypes about South Asian immigrants in the United States that make it so that committing crime against them, you are more likely to get away with it than not.
It's interesting. One of the things that's difficult to even think about here is that, like so many immigrants, this victim was, contributing to society. He was working hard, and from what we know, trying to provide for his family, and was just a great, member of the community here. And for something so tragic to happen to somebody who's innocent, and such a perfect example of what this country can do, it's hard to swallow. And with that, Suraj, can you kind of explain, you mentioned this earlier about how the issue of race and the race of the perpetrators and the suspects was injected into this conversation. You had a back and forth with someone named Hunter Walker, blue check, who used to be a White House correspondent for Yahoo News. I think he's now working on a book about progressivism. He went after you. He came for you a little bit, and it did not end well for him. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, he had a take where he was highlighting how a lot of right-wing commentators or right-wing pundits were highlighting how the perpetrators, the 13 and 15-year-old girls, were Black. I actually had not even done that. I actually have not on social media even mentioned that they were Black. I simply highlighted how tragic, obviously, the killing was, and basically calling people out based on their bad takes surrounding it. For one, we could look at, and I've been doing it on both sides. CNN got it, Hunter Walker got it, Charlie Kirk got it. I mean, it's kind of like whoever had a bad take, they got it. And when it came to Hunter Walker, I put him on the list for basically his first reaction going to the fact that, right-wing pundits and commentators are highlighting the race of the perpetrators. And I put him on the list. And then he came at me saying that I was showing concern for this particular incident because, or he basically he said I was one of the mainstream accounts that was dredging up and propping up far-right narratives. And then I responded to him. I said, "Hey, Hunter, I'm a son of a Pakistan. My father's a Pakistani immigrant. So the suggestion that my concern for the murder of a Pakistani immigrant is simply just me playing up a far-right narrative and not me actually just expressing concern because obviously I have a personal stake in all of this. It's frankly disingenuous and racist of you." And that turned into its own thing right there. I mean, I honestly was not expecting it to turn into anything. I honestly thought, technically it did shut him up because he didn't ever respond to me. He didn't rage DM me like a lot of blue checks who make the list do. But he was basically just getting hammered on it and ratioed. And it's kind of funny that all this news comes out today about him writing a book on progressivism. I mean, you'd think he would progress and understand and probably actually reach out to people who go through something rather than just say, "Oh, everybody who disagrees with me or has concern about a particular story has to be a far right bot," right? That's only what makes sense. Nah, come on, man. Get real.
Well, but this is where I think, this is a good case study in what you do with the list because it gets under the skin of little know-it-all corporate media twerps like Hunter Walker, who uses Twitter constantly to create these narratives as though they're just established fact, but they're often so, first of all, wrong, and second of all, often so insulting. Like what he said to you, it just shows the level of ignorance and the level of confidence. They're both way too high and they're both totally out of whack.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it was kind of that your exchange with him was representative of a lot of other exchanges you have with these guys who end up on the list, capital T, capital L, that you are constantly curating?
Let me put it this way. So some of the funniest responses are the people who really take themselves seriously. So take another example, Aaron Rupar from Vox. He is someone who constantly puts out content, videos that are selectively edited. And the latest example, obviously, is following the video he put out of Cherokee County Sheriff Captain Jay Baker, who is highlighting the whole situation involving the Atlanta shooter and relaying what the suspect told investigators. But the way he framed it was basically how he was making it sound like those were Baker's words on his own, not relaying what the suspect was saying that he had a very bad day. That was what the suspect was saying, not what Baker was saying. So it's something like that where you're like, this isn't at this point, it's no longer just misinformation. It's disinformation. This sounds deliberate. This is a deliberately edited clip and framing. And it got picked up as part of Chinese Communist Party propaganda and how they were basically criticizing the United States on Twitter about how basically the United States is a free-for-all against Asian Americans. And that's the type of stuff that we can't afford to have happen at any point in our history. So Aaron Rupar was one of those people who I put on the list, and he got really angry and rage DM'd me. In fact, I put him on the list at the end of 2020 when he was putting out a clip about the late congressman, or the late would-be congressman Luke Letlow, who died of COVID at the age of 41, very young. It was very tragic. And people were dunking on him for wanting to open schools. That's not like a bad position to have. In fact, many liberals have the position, even within the last few months, open the schools up. Like there's no reason to keep them closed. And so I put him on the list for that. He wasn't even number one. He was like number 2 or 3. And he unfollowed me because, and then he revealed to me, he unfollowed me because of all the harassment he was getting from me. Like he doesn't get harassment all the time, just from his normal stuff. Like I hardly believe that me, a Twitter account with like 82,000 followers is the reason why this guy is getting absolutely barraged with angry DMs and messages. Like, come on. I make the list to try to keep people like at least a little bit in check. Like it's not a harassment campaign, and right. It is designed to save people from themselves because they simply can't help themselves. They're constantly putting out misinformation and disinformation, or they just have horrible takes that everybody like just literally asks, what's wrong with you? Give me your phone. Like there's enough internet for the day. That's the reason why the list started in late 2019 when George Conway quote tweeted his wife, Kellyanne Conway, when she was still working in the Trump White House. And it was along the lines of the Trump-Ukraine whistleblower impeachment saga. And Kellyanne Conway tweeted out a clip of Joe Biden saying, something in relation to Ukraine, but he, probably about his cognitive ability or lack thereof. And basically Kellyanne was like, we need Ukraine to beat this guy. And then George Conway quote tweeted her and said, your boss apparently thought so. And I was like, oh, come on. Like, dude, give me your phone. Like, I don't care what the subject is. Do not dunk on your wife in public. Give me your phone. Like that's enough. That's enough internet. And that's how the list started. It started off as like literally a phone power ranking or power ranking of people who need their phones taken away. And it just like evolved into the list. But like, if it weren't for George Conway, the list wouldn't exist. So I guess thank you, George Conway.
For so many things, really. Yeah. I was actually going to ask you about the inception of the list. I didn't realize that that's where it started. But how did you realize? It's interesting that it started with one person, because it seems to me that what happened is you ended up having so much material that you had to like transform this like one thing of people who need their phones taken away into a list of people who have their phones taken away. So what are your sort of biggest takeaways about the Twitterati or our Twitter class from curating this list now for a couple of years?
So yeah, I know it's like a year and a half old now. So it's it's funny because as soon as the pandemic started, so it originally started off as a daily list. And then as the pandemic started, everybody was online. Everyone, no one had anything to do. So everybody was just tweeting out all their bad takes. I was deluged in bad takes. So I transitioned from it being a daily list to a weekly one to basically save my sanity. And basically what happened, I morphed into several things. For one, I got a Patreon for it. So if people want to actually read explainers on like why that person made the list, they can sub to my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Suraj Hashmi. And it's literally only dedicated to the list. I also do a Twitch stream, usually every Monday. I think this week might be, I'm traveling right now, so it might not happen this week, but I do a list stream every week now in which I basically compile the top 10 and I am basically explaining why a certain take is that bad and why it deserves to be on the list. And then I actually get the audience involved, and I get like a sizable audience, anywhere between 100 to 200 viewers. And I let them vote on what the take they think is the worst. And so it's turned into like almost like a community project. I have a Discord server with like 900 people, and they all submit nominations for the list. I got an intern who helps me curate this stuff to make sure that like we get everything. We don't like miss anything on the list. So it's like turned into like a giant operation of sorts. But this is the takeaway I've had from the Twitterati, is that you have a bunch of individual pockets, a bunch of different circles of people who have like, their own echo chambers. And so when they tweet, they are tweeting for their followers. They don't realize that like the millions of other people on the website can see their terrible take. Okay. So like you'll see a bunch of people basically responding to them, mostly their fans being like, oh, you go get them. Like this
Yes,
and then
queen.
yes, queen, yeah, slay. And basically once the list gets a hold of it, like the replies just completely flip to being like, what's like, to yes queen to like, no queen, what the hell is wrong with you?
No, queen.
No. So I will say it is interesting how the list has become sort of canon on Twitter, because I get tagged in so many posts of bad tweets. And it's interesting in a way because there have been so many bad takes on Twitter that it's almost like some have just regurgitated themselves. Some just recycle. And when they recycle, I can't list it. And when also, this is another interesting thing. I now have to make sure that the take that I'm listing is unique, because as soon as if it's like the first person to a particular bad take and then it spreads like wildfire, but I list them before that wildfire is spread and it becomes a narrative, I can list that individual for starting it. But if they're not the first person to start it and they just like, they're like a big prominent account, they just start it, or they get in on it, I can't list that person, because then I'm singling out that one person against the masses who are also saying the exact same thing. So there's actually come a level of strategy to it. I will say this though, during the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, and I had special lists, for like when Trump got COVID, during the ACB hearings, a number of different things, election. And one thing in particular, the ACB hearing, was that Hillary Clinton, who should know better, tweeted out something like a terrible take about how, like, way back when women weren't allowed to like practice law. So why should Amy Coney Barrett sit on the Supreme Court? It's like, come on, really?
Oh my.
You're an attorney. You know that. You know this. That's not what she's going to do. Like, it's that type of stuff where like she's part of the masses who are saying the same thing, but it's Hillary Clinton and she should know better. Therefore, she makes the list.
So is this list ultimately about how Twitter brings the worst out in everyone, particularly public figures? I mean, is that a takeaway from all of this? Because it seems 100%. Like also the list also seems to be like a commentary or a reflection on the incentive structure, because Twitter is a place where people are operating under this incentive structure where the more like the hotter your take is, the more dopamine boosts you'll get from your notification center. Is that kind of what you see happening?
Absolutely. In fact, it's kind of funny because some people actually seek out to get on the list because like it's like drives even more dopamine. They get even more followers, more engagement. And they, some people have that mindset of like any PR is good PR. And I think the list sort of comes into play with that, because now all of my, like I now have like a following where I have people following me on both sides. And they, I have people arguing with me about whether the take should be on the list. If I list someone on the right, I'll have people on the right argue with me. If I list someone on the left, I have people on the left argue with me about why that person shouldn't be on the list. So it increases the number of engagement for me. But I will say this: I have been accused by people on the right of trying to censor people because the list is all designed to take people's phones away. That's not what it's about. I think it's more about encouraging debate and more about getting people to understand, like, there are ways to tweet. This is not it. Like, do not tweet like this person, because that is someone specifically designed, either they're grifting or they're seeking attention, and doing it on Twitter, or there's something, either they're unstable in some way, shape, or form, and they're just taking all their frustrations out on Twitter. And those are times you're like, yeah, you got to give me your phone stat, because you're basically making things worse for yourself. But I will say this: every time some account does that, an account that got listed ends up getting suspended, that's kind of like become a fulfilling testament that the list works.
Well, yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this sort of like reflexive complaint that everyone who criticizes is now engaging in cancel culture, which is so silly.
Yeah.
It's not like you're asking for anybody to be silenced. And what
Right.
it's just like, dude, take your phone away. You're too online. And it's also
Yeah.
funny that you said it's become Twitter candid, because I just like, I've watched this thing grow, and I'm shocked, how many times I'm reading replies in a conversation that has absolutely nothing to do with you or conservative media, but it's like pop culture related. And I see
Yeah.
people coming in with the list emoji and tagging you in it. What do you think? So I've seen a lot of people respond to being listed with good humor and just sort of
Mhm.
having some humility about it, and taking their lumps, so to speak. But how do people, I mean, is it mostly positive, or is it mostly like, I guess I see people in the media as being very, very thin skinned. Like I think of Jake Tapper as kind of representative. I mean, he's on another level, but I feel like people are really thin skinned in the press. Has that been your experience? Like, are the reactions mostly petulant or, whiny and angry, or are people just, willing to kind of go with the flow?
My favorite response to getting listed, or to me listing someone, is getting blocked, to straight up, because that is almost my dopamine hit right there, because it's I don't know if they view it as like their ultimate thin skin, but like I never block people unless they like go after members of my family. Like if they go after me, fair game, I don't care. I might mute the person, but I'll never block them, because I feel like that's like an L right there, straight like a big fat L that I'm handing them a win. So when someone blocks me, that to me is like the surest sign of them having thin skin. And there's nothing wrong with blocking people. Like people do it all the time for all different types of reasons. But when you block me because of the list, that's like a level of deliciousness I can't even describe. Like it's too funny every single time, because it shows you they cannot take any criticism. Now, for example, with Hunter Walker, going back to him, he didn't block me. He just didn't respond to me. Now that takes I don't know what will end up happening. But it's probably going to be a situation where, he might get listed again and he might engage with me, but there's a good chance he might block me. And hopefully I'm looking forward to that.
Just so I don't know if you're following today as we're taping this, there's this like weird unfolding obsession that's turned into a trend about Glenn Greenwald, because he's so hated among sort of like legacy media types. And every time he tweets something that they can sort of swarm around, they freak out. I don't know what your take is. We'll have a different takes on this, but Glenn tweeted something to a USA Today intern criticizing a story that she had written. And then everyone in media, to the point about how I think they are generally thin skinned, freaked out at him for attacking a young woman. And they like used the word harassment. It reminded me of when they freaked out at him for criticizing Taylor Lorenz of the New York Times, a grown ass woman who works for the New York Times. Do those sort of spats have a broader relevance? I mean, as you're following them, are you thinking like, man, this does not bode well for our media, that they're bogged down in these insular back and forths over Twitter etiquette?
Yeah, no, I hadn't really been following the Glenn Greenwald thing, but honestly, like, what a great thing to happen for the intern. Like, you're getting attention from Glenn Greenwald. This is the guy who broke the Edward Snowden leak. I mean, even, honestly, I don't know why people look at it as a form of like harassment. Like, you're looking to make an impact in journalism. Sometimes criticism is like the best way to like get your name out there, even if it's warranted or not. Like, I am hoping that the next generation of journalists can take criticism constructively. Obviously not all of them will, but I mean, that's why the list exists, because they obviously don't. But I'm hoping that at least there's going to be some way for people who get into this profession, who get onto twitter.com and tweet their hot takes, and can look at it with a level of maybe humility, maybe a level of humor, and maybe not take everything so seriously. I feel like that's just the problem with everything, is that everybody takes everything too seriously, particularly in DC. And it's not like Glenn Greenwald lives in DC. I mean, the guy lives in Brazil. He's very much removed from all of it.
Yeah.
So I would wager that when it comes to things like this, I mean, Glenn Greenwald has how many followers? Like 1.5 million or something like that?
He
Or
has a
at
lot of
least
followers, but that's
he
what
has a
people
lot
were
of followers.
saying is the point that they were like, well, he could have done this without quote tweeting her, because when you have 1.5 million followers, and this is just like getting into the really dumb granular stuff of Twitter, which in order to do the list, you have to be familiar with. But if you have that many followers and you quote tweet an intern, you're knowingly sicking trolls on her, which you probably get accused of doing too. But it's like,
Oh yeah, all the
she's
time.
publicly celebrating her work. She tweeted it. It has to be fair game for conversation.
Oh, 100%. And I think if you do tweet something, and if you tweet at someone, it's fair game. Like if you tweet your criticism at some particular blue check, and the blue check who, like, say for example, is Glenn Greenwald, and he has that huge following, and he quote tweets on you, dunking on you, I mean, you did start it. I mean, but I will say this: Glenn Greenwald with quote tweeting an intern, you have to weigh the risk and rewards of that, because obviously people are going to criticize you for anything. Just make sure it's a good thing that you get criticized for. So in this case, I mean, if he's tweeting critiques of the young journalists, like it's not like she's a child. She's an intern. Okay. She's
a college graduate who has already accepted a job at the New York Times, by the way. She's writing for one of the biggest papers in the world.
I got into journalism at 25, 26. I didn't get my first actual job in corporate media until I was 29. So if she can get a gig with the New York Times at 22, 23 years old, good on you. You better learn to take those hits on the chin, or else you're never going to make it in this industry. So, this is your crash course right here. Getting quote tweeted by Glenn Greenwald. I hope whatever it is, whatever harassment gets thrown your way, I hope you take it and let it roll off your back, because obviously it's not going to get any easier from here on out.
Now, as you follow all of this, do you think that our media and our journalist class is like too online? Do you think it's actually hurting the media, that it sort of gets them into an echo chamber? Do you think it facilitates good conversation? Do you think it's maybe both? But I mean, overall, I of course think that everyone is like too online, capital T, capital O. But what's your take as somebody who's sort of like really into digging into all of this, on an hourly basis?
Twitter is the worst thing for journalism, hands down. There is nothing that even compares to if you were looking to be an objective journalist throughout your career, Twitter completely ruined that, because all of a sudden the wool is basically pulled over everyone's eyes, and they see what you tweet, and they realize what your biases are, and you can no longer perform your job to the ability you originally thought. And maybe people didn't actually think they're biased. Maybe people think that they're tweeting out a particular framing of a particular quote from a President Trump or President Biden is actually them doing objective journalism. Maybe they just don't know the difference. The important thing is, I think there are a lot of journalists who actually do not understand what the difference is between objective and biased journalism. And they only see people that are like on the other side. Say, for example, a liberal journalist trying to be objective, they only see conservatives as being biased, not liberals being biased. So it's that blind spot right there. But Twitter is really I don't know if it has made journalists worse. Maybe they were always like this, and it was just really us shining a spotlight on it. Kind of like how in the last decade there have been such a high volume of reported shootings by police of young unarmed Black men and women. We don't know if that has been happening for years before that, or if it was just through the invention of cell phones and the fact that we've been getting more footage of this stuff, that we've been able to see more of it, and so the spotlight's just on it. So that's just kind of the thing with Twitter. It's just like, it's kind of like that. Maybe this is how they always were, and we are just literally shining a spotlight on it.
No, I agree with that. I was going to say exactly. I think that theory resonates with me. It's as though these biases and faults of the journalistic class, existing in bubbles and echo chambers and having left-leaning bias always existed, but the incentive structure of Twitter exacerbates that and makes it much worse. Here's a question: what are the worst habits of people on the right on Twitter? Because you're sort of like doing this list without fear or favor, and you list people sometimes. Probably Tom Rogan from time to time makes the list, but what? I know that like Charlie Kirk makes the list. People who sort of do the clickbait tweets.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the worst tendencies on the right?
Oh man. Oh.
Is it the clickbaiting? I feel like
a lot of it is the clickbait. Yeah. Definitely.
Or the copying of Trump, sort of like trying to mimic Trump's style with exclamation points and caps in a way that's like, you can't do this. He's the only one who can do this.
So like there's been a lot of cringe posting from people on the right, but cringe doesn't necessarily mean list worthy. So like Ted Cruz is a good example of someone who posts a lot of cringe, but he isn't always exactly list worthy.
He also posts a lot of fire sometimes too, though. I gotta say
there is fire. I mean, but like, yeah, Ted Cruz is hit or miss. I would say, and this is the funny thing, is because like the standards change between the left and the right because, people on the left claim to be like morally superior. And like, there's no illusion of that from people on the right. And, there are going to be some folks who'd be like, yes, we're morally superior. Like say, for example, I'd say Matt Walsh probably makes it more often than not. But I also, there are times in which he like has a take that's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Or like he might be trolling. So that it's always tough because I feel like people on the right are much better at trolling and putting out those concern trolling posts than people on the left. So that's where I kind of get hung up. And it is definitely, say for example, I will say this, just in the last day or so, Matt Walsh tweeted about how the killing of Muhammad Anwar made him even more furious than George Floyd. And like that is a take that probably would be list worthy because George Floyd absolutely has nothing to do with this. But he's sort of injecting that in there. And then like Sebastian Gorka, for example, who blocked me a long time ago, is another person who kind of tweets that sort of invective and tries to basically, I don't know, start a war with people. But some of the best people who have been.
I was going to say, I think your point is that though people on the right do that, but they're not making any illusions that they're not trying to start a war. They're not saying like, I'm a neutral journalist who believes, the leftist equivalent of what Matt Walsh believes. Like they're like on the left, it's as though like this is the only objective reality, and I am conveying it to you as a neutral, objective journalist. But
and that's the thing is like there is people criticize conservative media all the time just because of they don't have that illusion, but it also makes it tougher for me to not police the halls, but basically hold them in check because there's no illusion that they are trying to hold themselves in check. They don't tweet with reckless abandon. Some of them are very strategic in what they tweet, but they don't pretend to be anything other than themselves. And if they are tweeting genuinely from their own point of view and they have a conservative take, like, for example, I don't list like policy debates. Like, for example, this whole debate about like whether trans girls should be in sports and the ACLU getting on it, like that's not really something that I can put on the list because like they're acting as activists now, and they used to be just very much focused on First Amendment issues and civil liberties, and they've basically become an arm of the Democratic Party as over the last decade. And so once that transition happens, like, am I just like giving them more attention at this point by putting them on the list? Or and so that's I've had to weigh that with like even groups with like PETA, because PETA tweets the most insane stuff I've ever seen, and a lot of it is very grotesque. And at the same time, like, if I'm tweeting stuff about PETA and that only draws more attention to them, isn't the it's kind of self-defeating at that point. So I don't even engage with them. Just
So
like, yeah, so that's just kind of how it is sometimes.
no, it is. And there are these like all this, the list is sort of a juggernaut at this point. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how there are all of these own little rules that people might not realize, but that do actually make it much more impactful, just in terms of what you include and what you don't. Let me like finish on this devil's advocate question of like some people might say, Suraj, you're being just as insular as the journalists, and you're being just as online as the journalists that you're skewering. But what's your sort of argument for why is the list important? Why is it worth so much of your time to sort of parse through Twitter and to be mired in the garbage, the junkyard of our sort of blue check, our blue check thoughts that they put into public every single day? What value is this bringing?
So real quick, I don't think I shared this earlier, but one of the like fundamental parts of the list is that I'm always on it. And that's kind of like the running joke, is that like people always tell me that I gotta list myself for like putting someone on the list. And I always respond with like basically one of the memes from the Avengers where the Hulk says, "That's my secret. I'm always angry." Where it's like my face is photoshopped on Hulk, on Bruce Banner, saying, "That's my secret. I'm always on the list," because like that is the running joke. Like I need my phone taken away because I make this list all the time. But yeah, it does it make me more insular? I've had to take take a step back or two every now and then, just realize like exactly what it is that I'm trying to achieve. So, for example, there is in the latest like attempted cancellation of Bill Burr, with him presenting an award at the Grammys and butchering all these Latino and Latinas names, and people calling him a racist. Latinx, I'm sorry, Latinx.
Yeah.
Basically, they, some person tweeted out a photo of him with his wife Nia, and she's black, and Bill Burr's white, obviously, and trying to obviously paint the point that he is not racist. And when someone responded, saying how like basically like calling his wife, quote, like I don't even know what rendition of this was, but like somewhere along the lines of calling her a sex slave, and Nia, Bill Burr's wife, responded with "shut the F up," and that just completely blew up. I initially put this guy on the list, but then when it came to the list stream and I actually had to decide whether this guy was going to be number one, I looked through this guy's timeline, and I'm like, there's no way this guy actually believes the stuff that he tweets. I was like, I'm pretty sure this guy's trolling. And as I kept reading, I'm like, no, this guy's 100% trolling. This guy doesn't even care. And I didn't put him on the list because that is something where like if you put it on there and you get it wrong, then it almost completely undermines the credibility of the list. So I'd much rather miss someone than put someone on there who doesn't deserve to be on there. And that has sort of made me realize that like, yeah, sometimes people are just on there to get a rise out of people. And it's not always like they are trying to just put out bad takes or they put out what they believe. It's just, trolls just like me.
Well, there's two important points there. The first is that you're self-deprecating and you don't take yourself as seriously as the rest of these guys do. And secondly, that it's just like, if not you, who is out there to keep them in check, and, doing it with a sense of humor, particularly self-deprecating humor, and doing it as tirelessly as you do, can really only be described as a public service, Siraj.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's actually kind of funny because I've thought about retiring it for some time now. And then every time I think about doing it again, everyone, like something happens and it's just like, you have to keep going. You can't stop. And I've had other blue checks reach out to me. Blue checks are like within the mainstream media, or at least part of corporate media, being like, this is a public service. You have to keep going. This is great. Like never stop doing this. And I hope it doesn't stop. And if at any point I do get tired of it, I hand it off to someone who is capable of doing the same thing.
Well, Suraj, it is not easy work, but you're out there doing it for the kids.
Wu-Tang is for the children, and so is the list.
Well, so you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. He is Siraj Hashmi. He is co-host of the Habibi Bros, and you can find him on Twitter at Siraj A. Hashmi, where he is the curator of the list. Siraj, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Emily. Always great to see you.
Now, we'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.